I'm James, and this is Producing Fun, a podcast about making games from a product perspective. Welcome to Producing Fun. This episode I talked to two guests, Paul Brook and Liam Kirkman. Paul and Liam run E Street Games, a UK tabletop publishing startup originally founded by Paul to produce a Viking-themed skirmish game with a unique approach to character creation. Paul and Liam's names were near the very top of my original invite list for this podcast. I felt sure that their unfettered take on the ups and downs of starting a new game publishing company would be really insightful. I am, once again, glad to say that I wasn't wrong, and if anything, the conversation proved to be even more fruitful than I expected. Their honest assessment of both their better and poorer decisions make for a set of really instructive and practical lessons on fundraising, the hidden financial costs of game complexity, the impact of personal taste on publishing decisions, marketing, and how to avoid accidentally offending eurogamers. From a lovely story revealing the huge value of just being friendly to as many people as possible, to a sobering one about the personal cost of making games, this interview was bursting with observations that I think even experienced game makers could do with being reminded of. It was tremendous fun for me. Commiserating with your guests' setbacks and celebrating their successes always is. Paul and Liam are great people and they've got some great ideas. I hope you find this one as much fun as I did. We join the interview just as I've asked Paul to take us right back to the beginning of the E Street story.
Absolutely. So E Street Games actually started, I'm just trying to think, I think as it was incorporated as a limited company, I think in 2013, so a good few years ago now.
Oh, right, yeah.
My first game was actually a Viking skirmish game called the Valhalla Sagas.
Oh, really? Interesting.
At the time that I was working on it, there were no Viking skirmish games around on the market, particularly. By the time I launched, there was about half a dozen.
Oh no!
And to make matters worse, the most popular one was called Saga. So the Valhalla Sagas. All of a sudden, people thought that the Valhalla Sagas was Saga, or that I was just like jumping on the Saga bandwagon.
Oh no! How frustrating!
So shortly after launching, I can't remember, it might have been just before launching, I had to change the name to Valhalla and drop the Sagas bit from it. That was an interesting experience, and I toured the various war game shows, and obviously there's a big difference between war game shows and board game shows. I toured the various war game shows, and I think that year we won something like half a dozen best participation game awards.
Oh, really interesting.
So so that it went down really well at shows, but hardly anyone's heard of it if they didn't see it at a show.
Presumably it was going down well at shows. Just so I understand it, it was going down well at shows at the same time that you're in this kind of market where there had been none of these kind of Viking themed skirmish games, and then suddenly they're everywhere.
Yeah,
it was still. Yeah. It sounds like it was still doing pretty well even in that environment, right? At least at the conventions.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But the other thing was that there was this kind of online aspect to it as well.
Oh, interesting.
You create your characters online, and then print off like a sheet of paper, and you play, and that's your kind of army or whatever. And it was very much incorporated into the core of the game, so it wasn't an optional extra. So I think that put people.
Oh wow!
That was I think that was a problem for people. Sort of join it for people to sort of. I think that was a barrier to entry. I think for people, it was the online aspect.
Interesting. So was it your plan then as well to have rule books and things like that also be part of that as a kind of web experience, or is it just that it was a kind of specific tool for character creation?
So the idea was that the character creation was online, and it was there to sort of help you set up your game and prepare before you had your game. I did have a printed rule book, but it was like at the time, most rule books were sort of costing about £20-25. Obviously they're more now, and I just did mine as like a little pamphlet sort of thing for a £5. So the idea was
interesting.
I was kind of going for a different model, and I had some figures. I worked in partnership with a figure manufacturer and sort of had an associated line of figures with it. But yeah, and it was really interesting because again, I did a podcast with one of the wargaming guys back then, and we did the interview, and then after the interview, he did a sort of a summary after we'd finished the conversation with me, sort of not on the conversation, sort of saying, you know, there were sort of the plus points and the minus points of it. And it was one of the things that was so interesting was I thought that everything that he said was really fair, and I hadn't finished all of the online stuff that I'd wanted to do, and I felt like it was incomplete. And he was sort of saying that from his point of view, he was disappointed that it didn't offer everything that he was hoping for, and I was very much feeling the same way as him. But he was saying that on the back of that, he said that he'd never had so many people contacting him, sort of saying, "What are you talking about? It's a great game," you know. And it's like,
interesting.
So interestingly, there was a following there for it, and you know, and when I saw him at a show later, he was all apologetic and stuff, saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, Paul," and I was like, "No, I thought what you said was fair. You know, I thought it was, you know, I wholeheartedly agree with you. You know, and also, I think the other thing is, I think when you're dealing with people in the media, my view is that it's important that they say what's true. You know, I think that I think that if you've produced something that someone doesn't like, then it's perfectly valid for them to say that. You know, I don't have an issue with that. You know, I think that you know, I don't think that every game is for every person, and I think that you know, that different reviewers will have different preferences, and if reviewers are happy to be honest about what they're reviewing, I think, and the reviewers have a loyal following. So I'm going off a terrible tangent here, James.
No, I mean, but I do completely agree with you. I think I would very much agree with that sentiment, and I think it sounds like to me that's a really important quality in being a publisher, right? You have to be able to listen to feedback from reviewers, and even if sometimes it's maybe a bit uncomfortable because it's pointing out things that, you know, maybe even in yourself you think, oh god, there's that bit is missing from it. That's actually quite useful, right, both to you and the consumer.
Absolutely. And more recently it's been interesting because I think particularly when you have a vision for a product that Robot Royale, for instance, I had a very definite vision for it, and right through the play testing stage, people kept saying, "Oh, we could add this rule, we could add that rule, we could add the other rule," and I was like, "No, I want this to be really tight. I want this to be essentially like a really simple game to get your head around in terms of rules. But actually, I want the players to really have to think about what they're doing. Which and obviously you've played it, and I'm very pleased with the result, but." You know, I don't know what your thoughts are, Mr. Terminator.
Well, yes, well, absolutely. I should. I have to indicate to the listener at this point that I have some interest in this, in that I was one of your super backers for your first Kickstarter project, Robot Royale, and I, in fact, am immortalized as the Terminator, as one of the robots from the game. So that's just for the record, just in case there's any kind of public query after this or inquiry into it. So. I think probably it's something I'd love to discuss a bit more another time. But the kind of question that occurs to me to bring it back to this Valhalla game is, you've got this really innovative idea for doing something with digital character creation. It's kind of natively digital to some extent, in a way that lots of war games are still not, right? If you were to look at
absolutely
the big Games Workshop games, they're still not like that. So I guess the next question I'm going to ask you is, why, what happened to it, and why did you decide, because as far as I know you're not working on it anymore, what kind of led you away from it?
You know, I think when I started, East Street Games had all these sort of big dreams of big Games Workshop and all that kind of stuff. I think as every if we're honest, I think every games publisher does, and it wasn't really achieving what I'd hoped. But also one of the things that I found was that I work as a computer programmer during the day, and I found I was finding it increasingly hard to focus on programming in evenings and weekends. And
the busman's holiday.
Yeah, exactly. So then after that, I then sort of moved on to I then played a game that some friends were working on, which was a zombie sort of game, and it was called Bullets and Brains by a couple called Casper and Christie. and it was an excellent game. And I sort of thought, right, okay, I'd really love to publish it. So we put together a plan to publish that, and I put a lot of money into developing figures and getting a particular sculptor to work on several ranges of figures. Put quite a lot of money into artwork and publicity and all that sort of stuff. And we got to the point where we were just about to launch, or we had just launched at Salute, which is a really big wargame show. Yeah, we sort of went along with, I don't know, however many sets, say 100 sets, and we sold about, I don't know, 10 or something. And it was really, and that was quite tough.
Must have been very difficult, yeah.
And then I think we followed that up with by going to UK Games. And then I think, and then after UK Games, actually, my wife was sort of talking to him about, how much I'd been spending on all this stuff.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's a big investment, isn't it? I mean,
it's huge, absolutely huge.
I'm guessing. Can you put a figure on it at all? Something approximate?
I can, but I'm not going to.
Well, okay. So it's probably about the same kind of figure that I had spent bringing Magnate to market then. So it's a sort of number that you just don't really want to talk about because it's such a substantial amount. I get that 100%. Yeah, I think people go into this, don't they? And they don't realize, they think that because of Kickstarter, like that it's any kind of game can be manufactured very cheaply, or to bring it to market, to even the sort of Kickstarter stage. And actually, unless it's a very simple card game, that's just not true, especially not with miniatures projects.
No, and I would say that, just and on a serious point here, and just to be really open with you and the listeners, just to highlight one of the risks that I would say that was probably the biggest challenge I've faced in my marriage, actually.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And we've and as you can imagine, every marriage faces challenges, but
yeah,
I think that was probably the biggest thing. And yeah, it was a really horrible time for me, actually, really, really horrible, and quite, quite bad. So
I guess that's quite a warning, isn't it? Which I think people need to be aware of. Is that, well, I think that's, and thank you for being so honest about that, because I think, that is something. I think, as you said, that's there's lots of challenges that people face, and I think one should never underestimate that like, if you're going to do this, it's obviously a big financial commitment, and any kind of big financial commitment, can add stresses and strains, right? And you've got to think about that kind of going into these kind of process. And I think that's a valuable thing for anyone listening to this to hear, I think.
Yeah, and it took a few years for me to sort of recover from that. I think I didn't shut down these street games because I couldn't face it or whatever. But after a few years, I kind of met a chap that was really into board games, and he was running the Southeast London playtest group. Greg Solgate. I don't know if you've.
So is it worth just saying a second there? What's Greg's role? Just because I think it might be a bit helpful, because I understand he runs the UK playtest. Can you explain that a bit more detail? What he does?
UK playtest group is obviously it's an organisation based in the UK, and they have it's like it's a meetup. I guess we'll have to assume that your listeners are familiar.
Yes, it's a regular meetup, meetup.com. I think people are probably pretty familiar with that. And it's a regular meetup for playtesting games.
Yes, yeah, that's it. And Greg ran the Southeast London one, so which was just in a pub in Penge, which was really good. And I think now they meet at the Ludicrous these days, because obviously when they started, it was sort of before the Ludicrous existed.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Great. And so you met him at this, and you met him and you started going to these regular events.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So I went. Well, Liam, I've done a lot of talking to this point. Liam, why don't you? I'd be interested to hear this story from your side.
So I'd known you a year or two through playing some war games. I sort of knew of you, probably met you a couple of times in a few years, and it was a sort of mutual friend of ours that brought us together. I was sort of recently made redundant from a job. Yeah, the matchmaking. So I was recently made redundant from a job at War Games. But actually, since that time, so pretty much in the time that I met you as well, I'd started working at the Ludicrous, and I pretty much as soon as I started there, I kind of, in a way that almost East Street has transitioned to board games rather than war games. As soon as I was working at the Ludicrous, I was just in the board gaming world like so quickly. And 3 years ago, or 3 and a bit, whenever it opened, I didn't actually know much about too many modern board games. I played a handful, but now I could talk about them for days, and I'm very passionate about them, and obviously what I enjoy and what I don't like. But getting back to that, so we had that initial meeting, and I remember you showed off some of the ideas you had, and those concepts are really exciting. It wasn't a case of this was you weren't just a friend I knew, and these were just some ideas, and I was like they're okay. They sounded quite actually exciting and promising from the start. So I know, we came together. So that would have been about 3 and a bit years ago as well. So pretty much as soon as I started working at Ludicrous. So a few different changes there.
So we're talking about 2018 there. So the Ludicrous, it seems, is quite a meeting point, isn't it, for these? Because if the local UK playtest events have moved there, obviously you were working there. And I think I just find that an interesting one. In case anyone's not familiar with it, it's the one of the UK's top board game cafes. I believe, in fact, last year it won the Gamma Award for best game cafe in the world, didn't it? So
absolutely. So not just in the UK, it's the world.
It's actually the world. It has a legitimate claim to being the world's best board game cafe.
It won the best board game cafe, and then I think it was best designed cafe. So I think aiming from an interior point of view, and also like the aesthetics and I guess the general customer service and things like that. So it won one just for being overall, and one was just the design of it.
So we're saying it's bloody good, and it's got a lovely interior. We can say that, and also that it is also again this really interesting meeting place where it seems that multiple people were coming together and meeting and discovering things, because I know lots of people I've met through the Ludicrous as well. It seems to be a really good venue for that. So that sounds really interesting. So you found, obviously you've met Paul, you've heard his ideas and thought, actually, these are really solid ideas and that they could make something. So what's next?
So then we got cracking on Robot Royale. So Robot Royale was my first go at making a board game. And I wanted to create something that was quite, where the rules were simple, but you really had to think about what you were doing in terms of like the gameplay. So I wanted the complexity to be like, what am I doing? You know, where am I going to move, and all that kind of stuff. And I suppose, So I think I'd like to think that I achieved that. You know, I think it's I'm very pleased with it. I'm very proud of it, and I still enjoy playing it now. You know, even though it's these years on. And
would you say that's a general principle that you're looking for? Is that something, especially in looking for in all games? Was this a game where, in particular, you wanted that kind of vibe for it?
I would say that's my personal preference for games, and I think that it's one of those things that preference I don't think does me any favors, because I think that in terms of Kickstarter, because I think on Kickstarter people are looking for things that have this fancy bit or that fancy bit or whatever, and actually I tend to sort of kind of quite like things that are sort of fairly straightforward.
Would you even call it a minimalist, even in terms of its approach?
For Robot Royale, I would, yeah. I wouldn't say that's necessarily like the goal for East Street, but certainly for Robot Royale, it was very much a minimalist approach, because there were all sorts of ideas that we had for sort of, well, we could expand it out in this way, or we could do this, or and there's lots and lots of exciting ideas that were coming up in playtesting, and I just kept batting them away, sort of saying no, complexity. I don't want to have complexity.
So was that Liam who was constantly suggesting, have this idea, or Liam, were you quite on board with this quite minimalist approach?
I was sort of on board with it, knowing sort of the restrictions of the game and what the idea and the intention was of the game. The things that may be added, like extra rules and making it bigger and things like that, they were coming from outside. So whenever we play tested the game, we'd probably had some of these ideas as well, but we kind of wrote them in a notebook, put them to the side, thinking not yet, or not for this specific game. And then when we'd go to shows and things, people would enjoy playing the game. We didn't encounter many people that disliked it, but there were a lot of people that liked the game, like, oh yeah, it's really good. Can you add this? Can you make them do this? Can you make them move that way? And it's like, we're sort of not necessarily going to do that, but we'll take it on board just because of the style of the game.
And again, I think going back to Playtest UK as well, obviously Playtest UK, the people that go along are board game designers, and I'd say the vast majority of them are Euro game designers. So they're always looking to add more complexity and more complexity and more complexity. Whereas that was really not my heart, or that was really not in my heart. Yeah.
So that's interesting. So do you think that typifies then a lot of what you've experienced in the sound of it, that there's this tendency amongst other designers to sort of continually add more complication?
Yeah, I think that the people that get into board games tend to be the people that really love board games. And my observation would be that they've played board games for a lot of years, and it's almost like they've kind of they've progressed from from the entry level stuff like Settlers of Catan that I was talking about earlier, or whatever. They've gone right through, and they're looking to kind of up their medication in order to get the same sort of hit.
Oh, I love that description. They start on Settlers of Catan, and in the end they need 1400 cc's of an acrony just to get a slight hit anymore. I like that idea a lot. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. So I think it's a real generalization, and I don't want to do anyone a disservice, because I don't think it's right or wrong, but I know there was one. I went along to one, and I don't come from, like, as I say, I come from a wargaming background more than a board gaming background. And I remember going along to one playtest meetup, and I just I played a game that was designed by literally an award-winning game designer, and we played through it, and everyone was kind of giving their feedback, and I just kind of sat there, and I genuinely asked, do people enjoy these sorts of games? And it was like, and obviously they do, and it's like, I wasn't being like, it sounded so mean and so bitchy.
And then you weren't invited back again.
It was just, oh man, I was lucky to get away with my life, I think, from that one.
Wow.
But it was a genuine question, because it's like, I just thought I just don't like these sorts of games. I like the lighter things in life. I like a bit of fun and all that sort of stuff. I don't really want to kind of spend my life like learning a whole load of rules to be able to.
I find this quite interesting, because I think my stereotypical view would be normally that people who've come more from the world of wargaming would tend to be people who would be into all the rules, right? Because they're a genre of games or rather a category of games that tends to be quite famous for being highly complex in the interests of simulating things. So that's interesting to hear that your taste is not quite that. Is that something you always found then, that generally the war games, or is there something different about Euro games in this kind of regard about when we're talking about complexity?
Yeah, sorry. And well, also going back to your point about war games, there are different types of war games as well. So I remember from your podcast with Louis, obviously you spent a lot of time, not a lot of time, but there was Louis sort of touching on Hawk and the history and sort of what.
Oh yes, yeah.
What Games Workshop games are like. But actually, if you park that the Games Workshop side of things and go to the historical wargaming, which is more kind of what I was interested in. You know, and I have done some of the Games Workshop stuff. It's not always that hard. It's not always that
interesting.
Hard trying, so that they'll often try to simulate things, but the rules won't necessarily be. You won't necessarily have the rules lawyers that you have in Games Workshop, where people are winning because they know the rules better. Person A knows the rules better than person B. You know, it's like the rules. The rules tend on the historical side tend not to be as challenging as in the sort of the fantasy sci-fi arena.
Makes sense. It's interesting. I think that's something that's it's really interesting to hear. I guess that they vary presumably considerably, because I know there are some of them, aren't there, that are a little bit more complicated. But actually to hear that actually a lot of the historical side is not always as fiendishly complicated, even though it's trying to simulate, is kind of really interesting. So that makes sense a lot in terms of then how I guess your game taste shapes what East Street is trying to do. Companies are very much shaped by their early employees. So I also want to know how Liam's taste ends up shaping East Street Games. I'd be curious to know that, and I guess because obviously Paul started the company, what you see your role as in the company now, Liam.
So so strangely enough, Paul does like these fun thematic games and not too rules heavy. And in the last couple of years, actually definitely during the lockdown, I've actually started to play some more of the heavier ones and enjoying them. And you know, some of those are in my sort of top 5, top 10 games. However, I know that those are games I enjoy, but I could only wish to design even if I wanted to, because there's so many mechanics and components to it. So I wouldn't necessarily be rushing to design those types of things now. But what that kind of gives me is I sort of, you know, the mid sort of level games that you see these days, they take some influence from simpler games and games above those as well. So because I'm playing pretty much the whole spectrum, I feel like I can assess what our games might need potentially, and it's generally the ideas or the additions that I might say might be more complicated. They might be unnecessary, but it's like I'm the upper part and Paul might be the lower part in terms of rules or complexity. And then we kind of meet in the middle a bit more. And that's probably happened quite naturally, because the first game with Robot Royale, it was also probably the simplest game we've done so far. And then the next game was a little bit more complicated. That was Mob Sitters, which is a card game. Probably only complicated just because the rules pages were a few more pages of rules, but not a terribly difficult game to learn. And then what we're sort of looking at now is almost like another step above, but it's still sort of gateway-esque area. It's not like a super heavy Euro. They may have some sort of Euro style elements. They may have a little bit of Take That or something that we're, you know, I know Paul coined the term Take This is might be featured in a newer game that we're working on.
Oh, interesting.
But yeah, so I feel like because I enjoy probably the middle to high complexity, I kind of want to try and infuse that in some of our games, but I also realize that actually what we both enjoy working on together is that sort of, you know, if it was a scale out of 5, we would like to work on like 2s and 3s, but not like a 4 and a 5 or something.
Right, exactly. Well, I mean, I think that is the BGG complexity scale, isn't it? So so that makes a lot of sense. So that's an interesting one. And I guess the next question that comes to me then on the back of that is thinking about how you select projects, because a difficult thing that obviously all publishers face is that there are basically a theoretically infinite number of games that could be made, and the problem is which ones are you going to pour the valuable time into to actually sell them, because you need to make money from them. It's not just a question of it being just a hobby. So how are you choosing these projects?
I think the criteria changes as we as we go along, really. So our first two games, so obviously we've talked a little bit about Robot Royale. That was chosen because I was really happy with it, and I was really pleased with it, and and it seemed to be pretty much nailed down rules wise, and it felt like there were a limited number of components, and it was something that we could do relatively easily. What I didn't necessarily appreciate was just how tricky it was going to be getting a game, even with a small game, even though it only had miniatures in. I don't think either of us really appreciated how tricky that was to just even to get that on the table was a real surprise to us. So the next game we did was Mob Sitters, which is purely a card game. And that was chosen again because at the time, I'd been play testing it for a few years, and I was quite happy with how it was playing and how it was working.
So would it be fair to say then that there's actually do you have a pipeline of projects, and you're kind of picking the ones that are most advanced from that then, partly? Because if you was already going for a few years.
Well, yeah, actually, until we get to the pandemic. So our next game after Mob Sitters was we had, so I think we'd sort of planned when we started Robot Royale. We'd planned, I think, initially doing Robot Royale, then doing Mob Sitters, then doing a game called Inhumane Resources. Which
I remember this, yeah.
Which was a game that again would need like 4 to 6 players. So to do that's not fully play tested yet, and obviously the pandemic hit. Getting 4 to 6 players together was going to be a bit of a challenge.
A big challenge, yeah, exactly.
So and also Mob Sitters and Inhumane Resources are very much games that you need to play face to face. Like Liam's done a really excellent mod for Mob Sitters, which means that you can play it online. But actually, playing it online isn't like, it's like a tenth of the fun that you have in person when you're playing it in person, and you're sort of teasing each other, and and just like the natural human interactions. As
I understand it, it's a game that has a kind of party game vibe, right? So there's an element of that to it in terms of it being a kind of family type game, and it's playable up to 8. Is that? Or 6?
6 at the moment. We'd originally, I think we'd originally hoped when we were running the Kickstarter, we were sort of we were aiming for 8, but then when the Kickstarter, when we pulled the Kickstarter, and then what we eventually released was just for 6 players. So now what we're doing is we're working on a 2-player game. So probably this time last year, I was sort of saying to Liam, I think it would be really good if we did a 2-player game, and I didn't really have any thoughts about what that 2-player game could be. I was still very much in the mobster world, in the gangster world, and
that's as in of the game, rather than that was your
main
job, as we reveal now.
This was the day job.
Organized crime, but specifically you were in the kind of headspace of Mob Sitters, this 4 to 6 player game. It's all about like face-to-face interaction. I've got you, take that kind of mechanic.
And that was very much like a gangster sort of world. It's obviously quite light-hearted because it's babysitters stealing from the mobster, basically.
Right, yeah. Lovely.
But when we got into lockdown, and in my head I was still in this sort of gangstery sort of world, and I started doing a 2-player gangster game, which I think which I was quite happy with how it was playing. But then I realized that it's a really dark world, and actually I didn't like it. I didn't like the whacking people, or demanding protection money and all this stuff. When you actually think about what you're modeling, it's really horrible. And I just sort of thought, oh gosh, I'm really not happy with this. I really don't like it.
It's so interesting you say that, because actually it's one of the projects I'm working on at the moment has that theme. And what's interesting about it is that if you try and do it remotely realistically, it actually strangely can be both dull and also horrifying. So I can understand that really it's not always the most appealing project. Now, I think we've got a solution to that, to make something that I think will still work very well, that takes in a very different direction. But it's interesting to me to hear that was part of the choice, that you realize, well, there's like a comfort with theme question here that seems really important in terms of selecting projects. Would you agree?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And so, which was how we kind of get onto our current that Liam and I are working on, which is where you can see that I went through a complete 180 here, and this game is called The Blessings of Bixu, and
The Blessings of Bixu. I like that. That's great.
The Blessings of Bixu. And it's a game based in the theme is that you're monks in the foothills of the Himalayas, and you're trying to become the next sort of bishop of your area or whatever, and you have to travel around the land, taking various things around, delivering them to the lands and delivering them to the monasteries and all that sort of stuff. Oh
wow, you couldn't really get more different to Gangsters, could you?
Yeah, exactly. So I literally did a 180, and then where the take this comes in, which was actually that was a Gregism again. We were talking about Greg.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
That was a term that Greg came up with, and it's the idea that basically when you complete a land, you get 2 blessing cards, and you have to give one to your opponent. You have to give at least one to your opponent, but actually you can give both to your opponent. Without, and you have choices about whether you look at them, whether you don't look at them, and you get, and basically the more risky the more risky the choice you make. So if you give both to your opponent without looking at them, you get 4 points. If you basically don't look at them, if you do look at them and only give him 1, you get no points. So, and then there's grades in between that. So
interesting. So my question then, Lim, what's the pandemic development process looked like then for this? Because obviously this is something that I think a lot of people are probably aware of as a difficult thing, and I think a lot of people would be keen to understand how, like, the practicals of how that's working.
Yeah, so the game was designed like over about a year ago, or just under a year ago, and the very first play tests we were luckily able to play these in person. It was maybe 2 or 3 sessions, and I know Paul made some iterations between each one, and it was gradually getting a little bit better each time, and it was starting to feel quite a good little game. It's changed even more since then, but the fact that we were working on this 2-player game, suddenly it made it a lot easier to play test remotely, because even if it was myself and Paul, then we know we can do that, and we can play a mod on TTS. But even if you've had people play test, it only needs to be 2 people. We don't need to gather 5 or 6 people around a table in person. It makes it a lot easier to play test, and also as well, it's probably almost kept us. It sounds a bit strange to say, but it's probably kept us motivated because this pandemic, no one's really known how long this pandemic's going to go on for, and it's only looking like there's light at the end of the tunnel in the UK, for example. But
oh yeah,
when Paul designed the game and when we were in the very initial sort of concept stages, we were thinking, if the pandemic lasts for like 3 years, we should hopefully be able to have this published, and suddenly people that are stuck at home with their partners, or just like one friend that they play games with, this is a 2-player game that they could play.
Oh, interesting. So you're actually thinking about it not just from the perspective that it was easier to develop during the pandemic, but potentially, depending on the length of certainly the lockdown measures, at least, I'm really hopeful that they're not going to be that long. But if that actually you could sell it into that environment as well as another opportunity.
I mean, the other thing with the pandemic is, even if it hypothetically goes on another let's say, year in the UK, for example, in terms of restrictions, then yes, hypothetically, you can sell to those people, and they're stuck at home, they need something to play with, maybe just one person. But also, even if everything lifts very soon and the world gets back to normal, a lot of people have been stuck at home, and they've opened their minds up a bit more to what 2-player only games there are. A lot of games,
interesting
a lot
point.
of gateway games are like 2 to 4, 2 to 5, 2 to 6 kind of thing. But there's quite a few that I would never recommend. Like King of Tokyo is a great, great game by Richard Garfield. You would never play that 2 players, even though it says it on the box. Like it just wouldn't work.
I have played it 2 players, and I can confirm it sucked.
Yeah, it's like you need that third, and even third is like not amazing, but third is like, oh, this is what the game's about. So I guess the bonus is that people are a lot more open-minded to 2-player only games, and they're a bit more exposed to them. And there's lots of really good 2-player games that have been out in the last 5-10 years. So Seven Wonders Duel is incredible for £20 or 22 quid, which it sells for. I know me and Paul have played it a few times, and it's just such good value that I'm really, really raving about this game. But it just opens your eyes to what a 2-player game can be, if it's just you and one other person.
Also, Blitzkrieg by Plastic Soldier Company as well. I'd say that's a very good 2-player game as well.
Interesting. So okay, so then I guess my next question is that, are we going to see an explosion then in 2-player games? Because presumably you're not the only people that have had this idea, right? That there's going to be other people developing a lot of 2-player games out there. Does that mean the market's going to be saturated with 2-player games in 2 years' time?
Well, that would be the East Street Way game, James.
just when everyone else is doing it, we're going to land at exactly that point.
That's it, yeah. But just slightly after everyone else.
Yeah, well, it's hilarious. I feel like, yes, it's very interesting. I think it's going to be that's the way that I think, not just the East Street Way and this one. I think I certainly feel like it's going to be the way for the whole market potentially, because it does seem like a very strong development choice, because it is much easier to develop, because either you can develop it with someone in person, because there's only one other person, or it's something that you can do online more easily, which is really interesting to hear that insight as well.
It's also something that anyone that was developing any kind of game, doesn't matter the number of players, the pandemic has obviously sort of caused a delay, whether that's playtesting or even manufacturing. Like, it's caused a delay somewhat, but that's some designers or the actual publishers themselves, they're thinking, is this just delayed and this comes out 6 months, a year later? Or is it they actively pursue other games instead or as well to fill that gap? But I suppose the way we're thinking, we're working on our 3rd game. And weirdly, even though it started as let's make a 2-player game, it's now become more of we've not just made it just because it's 2 players. The concept we like so much that, if the pandemic lifts and no one plays 2 players anymore, we'd probably still want to do weirdly. But I don't think that's going to happen.
That's not going to change. Oh, well, I think the really important point I like, which I'd not really considered before, of what you said about that some people's habits are permanently changed. And therefore, it's pretty reasonable to believe that actually the 2-player demand will actually also be greater, as much as there might be a surfeit of them for some other developmental reasons, which I think is really interesting. So far, we've not talked about any other designers' projects. Is that something that you would want to do in the future, publish the work of other designers, or are you very focused on what Liam and Paul can develop?
I would love East Street Games to be a publishing house where we do publish other designers' games. We've signed a couple of people's games. One of them actually we signed quite early on, and unfortunately we had to sort of go back to him after sort of Robot Royale, I think, and sort of say, look, I don't think we can do your game because it's just too much work for us. It's too big.
Right.
It's just like there would be too many components, too many mechanics. It's like it's as a game, like because Liam and I both have day jobs, you know, we wouldn't be able to, we just couldn't do it. You know, we just wouldn't have the time to put that into production. And I think that's again something that we've learned that there are limits on what we can achieve.
That's interesting. And what do you think the limits are in terms of what is the most time-consuming aspect of these additional tasks you have to do?
I think that's really interesting. That's a really interesting question, and I think it's really hard to say, because it's almost like there'll be kind of like little mini dependencies on things. You only need a small delay on one thing for something else to be held up, you know. And then if it's not your day job, then you sort of think, well, actually, I'll leave it to the weekend. And then the weekend comes, and you sort of think, oh well, I'd rather go out with my mates, you know. And it's like, and then you've slipped a week, you know. And I think there's all sorts of just little things that can happen that push things back. So I think we.
So how do you identify a project that's like within the comfort zone of what you can do right now, because you're not yet at the place where you can just live off the company?
I guess it's a feel for like the number of components that like literally how much artwork have we got to specify, how many miniatures have got to be designed, you know, how many components have we got to get quotes for, and you know, all that sort of stuff.
So it's a lot more about game complexity than component complexity. I mean, obviously those two things do tend to go hand in hand to some extent.
Yes,
but it's not as straightforward. It's not as perfect correlation between those two things.
It's probably fair to say, speaking of complexity wise, but this particular project, it was becoming apparent that actually, aside from sort of ongoing admin costs and things like going to shows, which were sort of a big expense, it was becoming very apparent that artwork is one of the biggest costs.
Right.
And for some of our games, I mean, for Robot Royale, the artwork costs were the front cover. We didn't really have any other external artwork, I don't think. Whereas Mob Sitters, we had lots of unique individual characters and lots of card art. And that wasn't extravagant, but it was noticeable. And so when we'd realized that, you know, this is what this costs, the artwork on this other game, and it would have been lots of artwork, it would have been lots of cards, lots of boards, lots of probably miniature scopes as well. It would be such a big project for us that it would have been very difficult to do without that money, even if we did have all of the time and all of the expertise, and we weren't doing our day jobs and we could do Monday to Friday 9-5 like very easily. It would have still been probably difficult without a lot of artwork costs up front almost.
So that's very interesting. So that makes sense. So there's a big artwork cost challenge there. I mean, that's something that with the next project I'm working on is a challenge as well. And certainly for Magnate was quite punchy. And the component thing you're saying is interesting, because that's been my experience. I've been very fortunate that during this period of when I've been working on publishing Magnate, I have been either, for most of the time, either part-time or for short periods, been fully focused on this. So it's not something where I've had to worry about fitting it alongside a full-time job for an extended period of time. So so that makes total sense. And I think that's probably quite an important thing for people to bear in mind if they are embarking on this journey, that the components add a lot of additional time. And then the issue you raised, Paul, about dependencies, certainly something that I've encountered quite a bit, has been how challenging that kind of dependency issue can be. So we've talked a bit about the pandemic as a problem for development. What about marketing? Because I know that, you know, a lot of small publishers rely on conventions as their bread and butter. So I'm kind of really interested to hear about how you've responded in that way and kind of where you see marketing going in future for your projects.
Well, I'm absolutely hopeless at marketing, I'll be honest, James. I'm useless. I think I'm entirely the wrong person to be talking to about marketing. You know,
Liam, do you have some answers for us?
I can give some answers. So neither Paul and myself are from marketing backgrounds, and also, well, there's marketing backgrounds, and then there's sort of marketing in board games as well as a completely separate thing. Yeah, we don't have that kind of experience, so we've been learning it over the 3 years, and some of that marketing has been either mostly Kickstarter focused, so it's about driving signups and making sure people sort of back on the first day as opposed to any other time. But it's just been a learning process since day one. We've made marketing mistakes. We've made some positives, however small, we see them as a positive. Specifically during the pandemic, like probably every publisher on the planet, we really sort of feel the absence of shows, because not only for the marketing benefits, but as a publisher, it's really nice to see people hands-on with your games. And of course, if you're selling and they're buying, great. But also, it's more of, they're meeting you, and meeting them in person is probably some of the best marketing you could have. So without a physical show, it's very difficult. I think it's obviously going to get better, but I think even with the digital replacements that there were, they were digital replacements, but they weren't really replacements at all. Some of the events did really well to do what they could, but it just can't replicate the in-person experience.
That's the sense I have. I had a chat when I talked about Chris, we discussed this sort of briefly. It does strike me that that is a huge problem, not being able to recreate the fundamentally physical, real experience of handling and playing games.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely affects independents more and smaller people like us. But I can imagine that, even bigger developers and bigger publishers would have found it hard. I mean, they have people that are proper experts in marketing online or otherwise, so they might not be feeling it as much, but they would have definitely noticed a drop somewhat from not having that presence at shows, either for meeting just general customers, the public, but also just meeting up with anyone for networking, things like that.
Yeah, very challenging, very challenging. Well, hopefully the answers begin to emerge, I guess, gradually over time as to how this can be tackled. I know it's something I'm spending a lot of time thinking about the right way to do it. I think it's something that I know the listeners will be really keen to hear is even more about what you would advise them to do if they're starting a game company now, because I know there will be people who will be interested in doing that. They might be thinking, oh God, this is the worst possible time to do it. Maybe it is, but people want to make games. I know that even if the pandemic were happening, Magnate was starting just as the pandemic was starting, I would still be trying to do it because it's my dream to publish a board game and then start publishing more board games. So I would want to do it anyway. So what would the 3 pieces of advice be if you had to pick 3 really top pieces of advice for someone who wants to publish games, not just design them? What would those 3 pieces of advice be?
I'll start with my thing, which I think is first and foremost my absolute number one. Then maybe if we let Liam have a go, and then I'll mop up with a third. So my first thing is basically don't assume that your game is going to sell. So treat it as I would certainly say from my experience, and hopefully other people will have a more positive experience. Be better at marketing and stuff than I am, and all that sort of thing, and their games will fly off the shelves. But I would say number one, don't assume that your game is going to be the next Gloomhaven or whatever. Mm-hmm. I think I've got a friend that's into horse racing, and he says whenever he goes along to the track, he treats every win as a bonus. He goes along with 100 quid in his pocket or whatever, and if at the end of the day he's going away with and he's spent all of that money, He still had a good day at the track. He's had a few beers. He's had a few bets. You know, he's had a good day. You know, and I think for me that's where I'm at. And I would say first and foremost, I would say I'd say don't be prepared. Don't gamble more than you're prepared to lose, because I think that if you're looking to make a business out of it, I'd say it's tough. It's a crowded market, and I think that there are no guarantees, and I think that there are probably I'd have thought that there are probably easier businesses to start if you just want to make money.
Oh, I think almost every business is easier if you just want to make money. Generally, don't pick a relatively small, crowded marketplace where you're competing against a lot of other people who are so in love with doing it that they will gladly do it for not very much money, which I think is something else that's really important to mention. Yeah.
So I think that would be my first thing, and I suppose that's a hard-earned lesson for me, really.
Liam, what about what's number two?
So this was specifically people that want to publish games as well as design themselves, not just
exactly.
Okay.
Anyone who's in self-publishing and beyond.
Okay, so assuming this person's at the very sort of beginning steps and they're asking everyone what can I do best or what can I do next, I would probably say it sounds quite basic, but try and meet as many people as possible, and just generally have a conversation with them and get to know them and talk about what each other does. It sounds very businessy and networky, but it's about, you know, that person you meet could be really influential to you in a way you don't realize at the time. I mean, Paul might have a small story about this from Ali Pali a couple of years ago, but you know, all those small little things, they can help, because you might get to meet someone and they sound excited by your game and they want to play test it. You might get to meet someone and they know another person that is starting out doing some artwork, and actually it's really good, and you could commission artwork through them. It sounds like a very obvious thing to say, but just get to know people, surround yourself with people. And I suppose we talked about the ludicrous earlier, but just being surrounded by that world is a very nice thing, because not non-customers, but even strangers, when they walk in the door, there's a very nice sense of community in the hobby itself. We may have felt it lacking in the last year, but not lacking online, but just lacking in person. I keep banging on about in person versus online, but it's just kind of keep in touch with people and have that rapport with people to just be able to talk about your projects, and you know, you don't know who people are going to know, so they might be able to help you in various ways, and you can also help them as well. If it's play testing or doing some artwork for them, could be anything really.
That sounds like advice that's worth repeating, because as you say, well, you could say this was obvious, but actually we love games. That's why we do this. What we don't love is networking. I think that's true for the majority of us who work in the games industry. So it's worth remembering that it might be not something that comes naturally, but it is something that's really worth doing. And you never know who's going to turn out to be someone important, right? And someone that's going to be, you're going to be working with in the future, someone you're going to collaborate with. And so it repays being really friendly with everyone and being very open-hearted with all those kind of connections, right? And in fact, you mentioned there, Liam, a story about that with Paul. Paul, have you got a story on this front?
I have. I don't know if you've heard this before, but have you heard it?
Please. Well, our listeners.
He doesn't know what the story is now.
Sorry. Oh gosh, sorry. So we were at the show at Ali Pali. The one that
this is Tabletop Gaming Live, takes place normally late September time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The one that Chris from your previous show.
Yes, Chris Egger, editor of the magazine. It's the magazine's own show at Alexandra Palace.
Yeah. So it got to sort of lunchtime, and one of my friends was there, and he sort of said, "Oh, Paul, do you want to come over and just take a break from it. So we went over and grabbed a pint at the bar and just sort of went and grabbed a table, and we sat down. We're sort of having a natter, sort of talking about the show. And this guy comes over carrying something to drink and a pie and something. He goes, "Oh, all right, do you mind if I just sit down?" It was a packed place, and we're like, "Oh yeah, have a seat." So we started chatting and stuff, and I didn't want to exclude him from the conversation, so we sort of included him in sort of, hi, what have you seen and all that sort of stuff. And he sort of said, how's the show been and all that. And the conversation goes along and goes along and goes along. And I'd been talking about my games and sort of saying how excited I was about Robot Royale and Mob Sitters, and I was talking very animatedly about them all. And this chap kind of goes, "Oh yeah, it's interesting." And then eventually sort of says, "Yeah, it's interesting because because I work in the I'm lucky, So sort of saying, "What do you do for work?" And he says, "Oh, I'm lucky enough to work in the board games industry." And so I just thought, "Oh, he must be another publisher or something." He's just sort of taking a break from his stand. And he says, "Yeah, no." He goes, "No, I'm the senior buyer at Asmodee." And
so as this is Asmodee's distribution arm. So this is the senior buyer for basically the biggest hobby game distributor in the UK, pretty much.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
okay.
And I'd had friends sort of saying what a nightmare it was trying to get in touch with anyone at Asmodee, and how hard it was to try and get a foot in the door there. And he sort of said it was so interesting for him to hear someone that was just like talking about their games without knowing who he was and without actually pitching to him as just like talking to someone that's just genuinely excited about their games.
Yeah.
He came over to the stall later in the afternoon, and he sort of said, he goes, Mob Sitter, he goes, play Robot Royale, and that's a solid game, but it's kind of a hobby market game. It's not a mass market game. And I was like, all right, okay, fair enough. That's cool. At that stage, we were just we were starting to play sort of a really raw sort of demo version of Mob Sitters. So this was
right
on the Kickstarter before we put any money into artwork. The cards were just like literally clip art that we just downloaded off the
right. Okay.
That we were just using for playtesting. And he played that, and he sort of sat back and he said, "Yeah, this could be a mass market game." I was like, and my jaw,
wow,
my jaw just
wow,
gosh,
interesting.
So he gave us his card, and he sort of said, "Oh yeah, stay in touch." So I emailed. He said, he said it won't be me that you're dealing with. It'll be one of the guys that reports into me. And I emailed him, I think, on the Tuesday after the show, sort of not expecting to hear anything. And then I think a couple of days later, I got a reply, and he'd copied in like one of the guys that reports into him.
Right.
And we've had quite a good relationship since then, really. So it's been
fantastic. And you actually have sold some copies into distribution?
Yes, yeah.
So that's to me, that is a classic example of exactly what Liam is saying, is that is such a good story. I'm glad you recounted that, because that you just don't know who you're going to meet. You don't know when you go to a place like this what's going to happen, and I think as things go back to normal eventually, whenever that is, that serendipity will only become more critical.
Yes.
So I guess that brings us then to our last piece of advice. So what is the third piece of advice that you would give any startup publisher?
I think, as you're talking about for publishers rather than game designers, I'd say, and I know this is like a really cheesy thing to say, but if you fail to plan, you plan to fail.
Right. Yeah.
Plan everything. Think about what you're going to be doing. 6 months ahead, a year ahead. When you don't leave. Try not to leave things to the last minute. I know I can be quite bad for that, but but try and at least think through what's going to happen, and like with your Kickstarter, if you do a Kickstarter, try and think ahead about what posts you want to be putting out during Kickstarter before you get to that time. So don't wait until you're in the middle of a Kickstarter and sort of think, oh, what post should we put out now?
Yeah, you want a clear plan for that before you go into the project.
It sounds so obvious, but it's so easy to just run, just to kind of run at things and not plan is so easy and so natural to do that.
If you're carried away by the kind of inspiration, right, that's something which is understandable. But I think, again, as we've said, just because the advice is obvious doesn't mean that it's not really good. And I think that's a really good example to me of, like, it's always worth reminding ourselves that we need to rein ourselves in a bit, do some planning and get that right. Okay, brilliant. Well, I'm sure that will be very useful. Before we wrap up, I'd like to find out a little bit more about what we can expect next from E Street Games. So what should listeners be on the lookout for from you guys coming up soon?
All about the blessings of Bixu.
Yeah, Liam, tell us more about the blessings of Bixu.
We are sort of, I would say probably about 70% of the way, 75% of the way in terms of overall rules, I think. Would you say that's fair, Paul?
Yeah, probably, yeah.
But we're looking to publish this sometime in the next year, hopefully. Probably a Kickstarter. And, there's going to be various reasons for that. But it's also going to be our most complex game in terms of components. Not necessarily, well, it will be complex as a game, but it's only gateway-esque. And yeah, so we're hoping to bring it out in about a year. And generally, it's quite exciting because, as mentioned, you go around the different areas of the sort of Himalayan mountain setting, and you're just trying to deliver these resources. But also, what we didn't mention earlier is delivering the resources to certain lands has this sort of scale where one of the lands might be in more favor of you. And you can actually, it's kind of got like a tug of war system. So if I give to a certain land and then my opponent does, it kind of goes back, the dial goes back to the middle. So no one's really favored in that particular land. There's a few funky little things going on with it as well, but it's hopefully going to be our next game.
Fantastic. What can we expect art-wise from it?
Art-wise, it's, well, how do you mean? Do you mean just?
So I'm just curious to know how is there a look in mind? What does the end product kind of look like? Do you have a kind of vision yet for the product, or is that as a finished item, or is that still something you're working on?
Oh, okay, yeah. So we have a really nice prototype at the moment that was actually made by me. I'm not tooting my own horn here, but this prototype was made in like a role-playing game map builder. And it's actually really nice for a prototype, but it's definitely not the final product. But it's going to be this really lovely map that's going to be very bright, very colourful. It's not going to be like a dark, scary game or anything. And generally, there's going to be quite a few sort of colourful components. And our hope is to potentially have really nice monastery miniatures. That's
very nice.
Sort of in flux at the moment, depending on what's happening with rules and also on costs as well. We're just looking into costings at the moment for what that might be, because if that's something that's just out of this world, we'd have to reconsider it. Or if it's, for example, on the Kickstarter, the monasteries are wooden tokens first, and then they're upgraded, then that is possible. But there's lots of things to consider, and we've learned so many things in the past about costings that we sort of start to really need to get our margins, like they need to start getting more perfect for us in a way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's something very critical, isn't it? I mean, I would personally always add that on as a fourth point. Make sure you've got proper margins on all of your products, because I think that is an element I know is challenging. Certainly, I've found that with Magnate, that it's not really quite at the level that would be ideal for distribution. I think it's worth it anyway. I think hopefully people will be wowed sufficiently by it that we can make lots more sales in the future. But it's one of those ones where, yeah, margin sounds like it's obviously critical to do. Again, one of those ones that you don't necessarily work out how to do properly until you've had the experience, though.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, our first two games have been reasonably small print runs in terms of they weren't made sort of in China at mass production. So the margins on those games were never going to be like really good. It wasn't going to be like, we're going to make this game for like £1.50 and we're going to sell it for 20 quid or 15 quid or something.
Yeah.
You know, but they weren't completely like awful. It just wasn't something that was going to make us like millionaires or anything. Or make it sort of sorry, go on, Paul.
No, I'd say I was just going to say, actually, I think the margins on Robot Royale were awful, and I think especially when you look at the lead costs for the miniatures and all that sort of thing, I think there were a lot of costs there that, in addition to the production costs, you know, and yeah, it was. I think we learned. Let's say Robot Royale was a huge learning experience for us.
Right, yeah, completely.
That's true, but I suppose with Robot Royale, because that was mostly sold through a Kickstarter, we weren't like selling through retailer distribution. So even though it was a very small margin, we were still getting something back. Whereas Mobster, for example, is a little bit better. And any game going forward, we always have to bear that in mind.
The blessings of Bixu is going to be a bit better margin-wise in the sound of it, with your experience.
Yeah, and sorry, I was just going to say with the Bixu thing, it's there are place names and things, and all of the names are Nepalese actually, and the reason.
Oh, really? Interesting.
And the reason for that is a couple of years ago, I moved down to Folkestone from Croydon, and there's a large Gurkha base here. So there's a huge Nepalese community.
Oh, interesting.
So I wanted to do something to as almost like a homage to them, really, or honouring them.
That's so cool. So we've got kind of authentic language, effectively from Nepal, which is being used in the game. Which that sounds really cool. Well, I'm excited to hopefully get to play it at some point in the not so distant future. That sounds really great. And I just want to say, in general, thank you so much for joining me. And I'm sure hearing the story, the real kind of trials and tribulations that one goes through as a startup publisher, is going to be of real interest to many of our listeners.
Well, thank you for having us on, James. It's been really, really good chatting to you.
Yeah, it's been really good fun.
Producing Fun is produced by Naylor Games. If you enjoyed the show, follow us on Spotify, Stitcher, or other major podcasting platforms. Remember, Producing Fun is also a product, and it thrives on feedback. So please leave a review wherever possible, or simply send me your feedback directly. You can message me on Twitter @NaylorJames, or write me an email, james@naylorgames.com. Until next time.